Okay, here we are. All right. Hello, Sue. Okay, Sue is here. She doesn't have sound yet, but she's here, so we can start. She doesn't have a microphone, at least. Okay, connecting to audio. All right, here we go. So we're talking about the truth. We're talking about Emes, or Emet, truth. And we're going to spend a few weeks on this topic. And we're still not so much into the practical, like telling the truth or living the truth. We spent last class exploring an essay by Rav Eliyahu Dessler entitled The Truth Perspective. I should say we explored part of the essay. And I'm going to do a quick review of that because that's going to lead us into today's class. And what we're talking about is living with truth, sort of being honest or finding the truth in our decisions and that we make in our life choices. So a much sort of a deeper truth, not simply, although it's very important, our day-to-day, the way that we speak. Do we tell the truth? Do we conduct ourselves with integrity, which is also part of this broader topic, but we're now looking at sort of at the bigger picture of life and our decisions in life true. And we talked about how just as a scientist, when he's conducting experiments, he or she is conducting experiments, they need to make sure that their instruments are working with precision and there are no outside factors affecting or throwing off their calculations and their conclusions in order to arrive at true conclusions. So if that's true in a scientific experiment, it's certainly true in the experiment of living, of life, where we have our own instruments. It's our mind, it's our intellect, our seichel, as they say, that we have to, how do we know, or can we be sure that our mind is working with precision and is not being affected by external factors that may be corrupting our decision-making or damaging or affecting it in the wrong way? And how can we be sure of that? And the truth is, it's really not so simple. We know we can look in the Torah for some ideas about this, and if we look at those decisions that we need to make as, let's say, judgment calls, life is full of judgment calls. What do I do today? Should I do this or should I do that? Is this the right thing or the wrong thing? How should I live my life? Right? Very important judgment calls. And so we can learn a bit about the laws of judges from the Torah and apply it to our lives. And we know it's pretty, not just in the Torah and civil life as in the civil society as well. It's, obviously a judge is not allowed to accept a bribe. And the idea is, right, why can't a judge accept a bribe? I'll say, I'll take a bribe, but I'll judge impartially. Don't worry. I'll accept the money. What's really wrong with that? So the Talmud poses this question, and the Talmud explains that once the judge has actually taken the bribe from one party, so he then becomes close to that person in his mind. He has now a connection. He identifies with that person, he or she, and once we identify with another person, they sort of become a part of us, and it's hard to see anything to our own disadvantage. We always want to see things in a positive light for ourselves. And so now we're expected to judge a case, but we already feel some partiality to one side. And once that's the case, then our judgment is affected. Our judgment is now biased. And the idea is that our judgment and our reasoning is very, very delicate and easily thrown off. A little bit of bias can prevent us from either coming up with an argument on behalf of, let's say, one side, or if the argument is presented by someone else, then it can affect us from giving it proper weight if it goes against our interest, right? We talked about that in order for us to start thinking about something, we usually have to be interested in it first. So if you're flipping through a newspaper, you don't think about the things that you're not interested in. You just gloss right over them. And the same is true when, let's say, we're judging a case. If we're judging a case, then that which we have more interest in is where our thoughts will go. If we have this bias towards one party, then we'll be thinking of ways to help out that party, and we won't be thinking of ways to help out the other party. That's what the Torah is teaching us with this. And we won't be producing arguments on one behalf. We'll only be producing arguments on the other. And that's just what happens once we have that connection and that closeness. And it's true even when someone else presents an argument, so we will automatically doubt it or refuse it because we're already being pulled to one side. And this is, again, we're talking about in the realm of judgment as a judge in a court case. This is what the Torah talks about, and we're going to apply it in a moment back to our lives. And but before we do that, what is the minimum amount, that could affect me? We said we posed that question. And maybe if it's just a couple dollars, I'm not going to really be biased towards that person. Maybe maybe $100 or more, right? That'll make a difference. What amount can pull us? Can cause us to be biased towards one side. And we saw in a story in the Talmud, and there's really a series of stories all on the same page, on 105b of Kesubos, where different sages in the times of the Talmud had little favors done for them, and they said, oh, that disqualifies me from judging your case. So in one instance, Shmuel, not Shmuel the prophet, but this was Shmuel, one of the great sages of the Talmud. He was, I think, traveling across a river, and he met someone by the ferry, and the person extended his hand to help him get on the ferry. And he said, oh, what are you doing here? And the guy said, oh, I'm on my way to have a case judged by you. So he said, okay, well, in that case, that disqualifies me because you helped me onto the ferry. So even that little thing, he sensed that could create a bias. And it has a couple of stories. We learned a story last week about the sharecropper of Rabbi Yishmael, the sharecropper brought the harvest a day early. He brought Rabbi Yishmael's own food to him, but he brought it a day early, and Rabbi Yishmael felt that was already too much of a favor. He couldn't judge that sharecropper's case. And the Talmud actually recounts how when Rabbi Yishmael walked past the court case and he was listening in, he was coming up in his mind with arguments, and he said, wow, look, I feel how it's affecting me, and he only brought me my own food. Right? And what did he do for me already? Just a little favor that he brought it a day earlier and he really did it for his own convenience. But it was a little bit of a benefit to me, and therefore Rabbi Yishmael said he felt that he was affected. So the smallest amount, the littlest favor can really tilt us in one direction when judging a case. And on top of that, we talked about how it's important that the judges hear or at least see both of the litigants at the same time, because otherwise, if they see one and hear his story, they're going to become favorable to that person's story. And even though the judge knows that there's another side to this story, but once it's set in his mind that this person is right, then it's provisionally set in his mind because he knows there's another side that he's going to hear. But for now, he's hearing this side. But still, at that point, it's hard for a person to change their mind. And even when we know that it's likely that we'll need to, but at that point, it's uncomfortable to change our opinion. And we're biased just in our first notion, and we're biased towards that. So unless the facts are blatantly against it, then it's going to be hard for us to change our mind. So a judge is setting his ways, and similarly we're setting our ways, and it's hard. We're biased towards whatever we're set in our ways because it's uncomfortable for us to change them. So taking those laws of judges from the Torah, now applying them to ourselves and saying we're all in the position of judging, and we're continually called upon not to judge others. That's not where we're going with this. But we're continually called upon to make judgment calls in our life, of ourselves, judge our own behavior. Am I doing the right thing? Am I making the right choices in life? And we're talking about big choices. We're doing little choices, little things that we do on a day-to-day basis. And if we consider all these factors and take them from out of the courtroom of the judge and apply them to our lives, what we're going to discover is it's really hard to make a decision without that incredible bias that's created by all these factors. So for example, right, the last thing we said, a preconceived notion, right, that it's hard for someone to change their mind. It's hard for a judge to change their mind. And once they hear one side of the story, and if the other litigant isn't sitting there, that they see that there's another side, then they're already going to become partial towards the first side of the story. So what about in our lives? So we have this disinclination to change our mind, and that could come from laziness, it could come from arrogance. It could come from many different places, but it exists. So if we're going to be faced with a question in life, but we already have a preconceived notion about that question, or to choose one answer to that question, we're going to have to change something that we're already set in those ways. Well, that's really hard. So are we really going to give that question a fair, both sides and all sides of the argument a fair look? Not necessarily, because we're biased already. Because if answer A means I get to stay the same way and live the same way I've been living and do the same things I've been doing, but answer B means I have to change, well, we're not going to give B a fair chance, right? It's just how we are. It's an ingrained bias based on this disinclination from changing our minds or changing ourselves. So that's first of all. That's simply just without, just because it's been that way all along. That without, adding the factors that we're now going to add. The second factors, the second level is that, like we said, a judge, right, once he or she feels a connection to one litigant, it's hard for them to see a disadvantage, it's hard for them to see bad in themselves. So what about ourselves? Can we really properly judge our actions? Now we're always it's gonna be hard for us to admit to fault, to admit that maybe there's something that could be changed, because we're so we love ourselves, and we should, and we're close to ourselves. But certainly if a judge has trouble seeing fault in one litigant because he now feels a connection to that one, then certainly in ourselves, we're also going to have that, it's going to be difficult for us to see something bad in ourselves. We're always going to judge. So if you examine a certain behavior, and on side A, we have to conclude that, maybe it's not such a good behavior and we should change that. But side B is, no, we justify it, we can explain it. Well, which one are we going to choose? It's hard to grapple with the possibility that maybe I'm doing something that could be improved on, that maybe I do have a fault. It's hard for us to come to terms with that. So we'll choose B. We'll choose B. We'll explain it. We'll go with the arguments that justify it. We'll take that side of things, because again, we're biased. And lastly, and perhaps the most strong, is the bribe of our desires or our comfort zones, or all the things that if there would be something that we would have to change or give up that we really like, that if we conclude with answer A, right? So again, if we're presented with a question and we get to choose between A or B, and B and A means giving up certain comforts and certain things that we enjoy, certain pleasures in life, and B means keeping them. So whose arguments are we going to give more credence to? Again, we're biased, and we're going to give credence to arguments B, and we're going to we're going to try to justify side B, and we're going to try to ignore side A as much as possible, because again, it affects our life and we're going to lose out on things that we want potentially if we choose side A. So if we're brought such a question with side A and side B, are we really going to give A a fair chance? We're not, because of that ingrained bias that's choosing side A will cause us to give up on things in life that we may not want to give up on. So the question becomes now, when faced with important decisions that any of these factors apply to, can we really trust our own judgment to arrive at the truth? Are we going to judge truthfully at the end of the day? And the answer seems to be that no, that it's impossible, that we will not arrive at a true conclusion, and we can't trust ourselves, and we have to face this question, this very difficult question. How can we ever rely on our intellect to give us true conclusions in any matter? So it's an important question. That was the question we posed last week, and this is all again based on an essay of Rav Eliyahu Dessler. And Rav Dessler concludes that we have to admit that that our intellect is powerless to produce reliable results in a moral problem because of all these ingrained biases. How could we ever arrive at a true conclusion? We have to first cleanse ourselves of those biases. If we're free of those biases, so then we can trust our conclusion. And since these biases are caused by character faults, so then we have to eliminate those and replace them with a desire for truth and integrity. And then we can make decisions or trust our decisions. And it really circles back to the journey to virtue. It circles back to the study of Musar, the study of self-development. Because in order to rid ourselves of those biases, the path is Musar, is developing ourselves, character development. And once we have developed our characters, that we're free of arrogance and material desire, and we've worked on our integrity and all of these things, so then maybe we're ready to approach a problem with integrity. But of course, this takes many, many years of working on ourselves, right? Of Musar is not a 1 week thing. It's not a 7 week course. It's not a 1 year course. It's years and years of working on ourselves and trying to improve. And perhaps then we could cleanse ourselves of negative character traits, of biases, and that will allow us to come to correct conclusions. So that's ultimately the answer, is to learn Musar and free ourselves of those biases. Then we can trust our moral decisions. And that's what we learned last week. Now the question is, what do we do in the meantime, right? While we're working, is there any way forward? How do we make a decision and trust that we're choosing truth and we're not being taken by our own character failings and that those are impacting, throwing off our instrument, throwing off our intellect? How could we be sure of that? Just to create a caricature of a person maybe who's grappling with this. So Rabbi Dessler describes, the following person. He says, imagine a person who's a smart person, wise, a keen intellect, well-educated, well-informed, someone you might meet out on the street, right? And or at work or wherever. But this person hasn't spent the time on character development. which is true for much of our society, right? So you meet very nice people, and they're well informed and they're educated, and they express opinions, but they probably didn't spend so much time learning Musar. So many of these people, many people will not have properly tackled their moral failings. So let's imagine someone like that. And so such a person, if they're insulted, they might snap back because they haven't, right? We talked about that, right? Not responding when someone insults us, right? But let's say someone hasn't worked on that. So they, and it's true for me probably, right? We might still snap back. We haven't perfected that. And if we do something that's praiseworthy, we want people to know about it, because this person, again, we're making a caricature. There's this person of keen intellect, but he wants, if he does something, he makes a big donation or something. If he ever does that, then he wants everyone to know about it. He wants an interview on TV. He wants to, because he has a little bit of arrogance, let's say. Let's say this person, if he's tempted by his base desires, then there's no saying what may happen. He might succumb to his desires, especially if nobody's going to find out. He's off on vacation somewhere, right? He might do something if nobody will know, right? Such a person. So he looks like a normal, good, decent citizen, and he is, because you know what? This is probably a description of many, many, many people. And again, to be perfect is difficult. So, but let's imagine this person now tackling an important moral question, and we're in an argument with them on a topic of morality, let's say. So when this person represents one side of that argument, are they going to be coming, from the perspective of truth and integrity and always just seeking, they want to know what's the truth? Or would such a person have many biases? And based on what we've said, especially if the decision, if it's a big question, let's say, is there a God, right? So there's many atheists in this world, don't believe in God. But let's talk to the atheist for a second, right? Does when approaching this question, does God exist? Or, maybe relevant for us, did God give us the Torah, right? So when approaching such a question, so how are we approaching it? Because if we understand that the answer to that question may impact our life, so can we really say that we approach the question impartially, right? With impartiality? Or are we going to be biased because we understand that the implications of that answer are major? So, right, so this atheist, if he believes in God, if from this discussion, right, he comes out that he believes in God, so then usually belief in God should come with certain obligations. Throwing off the yoke of God and not believing in God, you're free to do what you want, right? So your morality is whatever you decide it is. So this is a big decision, and it's going to affect his life. So is he really going to approach that question with impartiality, with fairness? The answer is no.
Not really.
He's totally biased. How could that question be approached without bias? And yeah, so it comes back to this point that really, until we work on our character traits, we can't really come to such important questions with truth and integrity unless we overcome all those desires and we overcome all those biases. Then we can now consider the different sides of a question, of an important question, and come to a decision. So where do we find truth? So let's look at the source sheet and look at number 1, and it's a very interesting midrash. And the midrash says as follows: Rabbi Shimon said, At the time that the Holy Blessed One, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the time that God came to make the first human being, the angels, the ministering angels, made themselves into competing councils, with one group opposing the other. Some of them said, don't create humans. And the others said, create them. So it is written, it quotes a verse in Psalms, kindness and truth met against one another, righteousness and peace faced each other. In Hebrew, chesed ve'emet nifgashu, tzedek v'shalom nashaku. Kindness and truth met, righteousness and peace faced each other, and what happened? So the Midrash explains, the angel of kindness said, create them, create human beings, for they will do acts of loving kindness. Human beings will do acts of loving kindness. So chesed, kindness, said, create them. Then the angel of truth said, do not create them, for they will be full of lies. Full of lies. That's how human beings are, according to this Midrash. They're full of lies. That's what the angel representing truth said. The angel of righteousness said, create them, for they will establish justice. Right? So we have acts of love and kindness. We have justice. You know, we do have those, right? In American society. The angel of peace said, do not create them, for there will be constant strife. Right? There we have that also in American society. We have a lot of strife. So what did the Holy Blessed One do? He grabbed up truth and hurled it to the earth. Very interesting statement. He threw truth to the earth. Where does that come from? It comes from a verse in Daniel. So it is written, you hurled truth to the earth. It's a verse in Daniel. But it says, V'tashlech emet arza. He hurled truth to the earth. Whereupon the ministering angels said before the Holy Blessed One, said before God, ruler of all worlds, what have you done? Why have you despised your seal? Truth, emet, is the seal of God. We'll hopefully talk about that in a later class. They said, let truth arise again from the earth. Here it says, the implication is that they said it. It could be that God said it, and that's, I think, the approach that we're going to take. Let truth arise again from the earth. So it is written, and it quotes another verse in Psalms, truth springs up from the earth. Truth springs up from the earth. So a very, very enigmatic midrash, like what on earth is going on? And there's certainly been a lot of ink spilled to explain this midrash. But just to summarize it again, basically it says that when God wanted to create mankind, so the angels challenged that, and they said, and there were different sides, and the angel representing kindness and the angel representing justice was all for it. They said, they love kindness, they'll do acts of kindness, they'll have justice. And the angels representing truth and representing peace said, don't. The one representing truth said, no, they're full of lies. The one representing peace said, no, they are full of strife. And it says that God took truth and hurled it to the ground. And when the angels say, how could you do that? God says, let truth arise from the earth. So it is written, truth springs up from the earth. So what's going on here? So let's look at the next source, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. So this is going to be, we're going to probably come back to, number 2 is a quote from Rabbeinu Yonah, Sha'arei Tshuva, the gates of repentance. And in Sha'arei Tshuva, he talks about those who lie, liars. And he lists 9 categories of lying. We'll probably go through them at some point just to see, the levels of integrity and truthfulness when we get to the more practical. But we're just singling out this one for one line that he says. So the 7th section that he lists is one who fools his fellow, saying that he did him a favor or spoke favorably about him, but he did not do so. So you claim to have done something for someone, but you didn't. Our rabbis, may their memory be blessed, said in the Talmud, Chulin, that it is forbidden to deceive or steal the mind of people. And note that this was more weighty among the sages of Israel than theft. okay, for lying lips is certainly a cause of great guilt, and we have been obligated about the fences of truth, because truth is from the foundations of the soul. So without going into what he means that it's more weighty than theft, which I think is something that we can probably think more about and spend more time considering, but he's talking here basically about what in Hebrew we call gnevat da'at. So telling someone you did something for them when you didn't. Another example might be like inviting someone, when you know they're going to say no, right? So you score some points, right? But maybe they'll even send you a gift for your wedding, right? Like if you invite them. Now, if they want, if sometimes it's to honor them and they want to be invited, even though they're not, they can't come. But sometimes, somebody just wants to score some extra points. They know they're not coming, right? So that would be another example. It's dishonest. But I wanted just to look at the last line, which I underlined. And he says, the reason why it's so important is because truth is from the foundations of the soul. It's from the foundations of the soul, which is like, it's a basic part of the soul, it seems to be what he's saying. So let's compare this with what we just read from the Midrash, because the Midrash, the angel said about man, that man is what? Full of lies. Full of lies. And Rabbeinu Yonah, a medieval commentator, is writing that and he's fully familiar with this Midrash, he's writing that truth is from the foundations of the soul. So is that a contradiction or not? So Rabbi Shlomo Volbe, in his Alei Shor, who we've been drawing on a lot, Rabbi Shlomo Volbe explains it's not a contradiction. The nefesh, the soul, has a foundation of emes, of truth. That's the spiritual part of us. But the body, the physical part, so that the body is what has the physical desires, the biases, right? So that is full of lies, like let's say, and that's where the potential the body, the physical part of us, overrides the spiritual part and quashes it. And really, the goal is for us to always, and this is the constant struggle of the neshama and the guf, the body and the soul, is to allow the soul to control the body and not allow the body, the physical, to control the spiritual. So this speaks to the struggle of our lives, the daily struggle of our lives. And we're just putting it in new terms now, where we're talking about it as truth and falsehood. Truth being the right thing, the will of God, and falsehood being the wrong thing, going against the will of God. And what he explains is that this whole conversation between the angels relates to another conversation, which I have in number 3, which some of you learned with me when we learned about Shavuos. When we learned about Shavuos, we looked at this. The class was more than just cheesecake. And we learned this piece of Talmud in number 3. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing right now for the sake of time, but you could read it yourselves. I'll just summarize it. The Talmud describes that when Moshe went up to the heavens to receive the Torah from God, so again, the angels challenged and they said, God, what are you doing? What's this human being doing here? And you're going to give him your Torah? You're going to give him this precious, precious Torah? And God says to Moshe, you answer them. You should respond. And Moshe basically tells the angels that, why the Torah is given to man and doesn't stay here in the spiritual realms with the angels? Is because the Torah is meant for the physical world. The Torah is meant to elevate the physical man, human, and to take and to help us. We are lacking. We aren't perfect, and we have failings, and that's why the Torah is meant for us, because the Torah is what can help us improve. So he says, let's say he said, what's written? It says, honor your father and your mother. He said, do you have a father and mother? Do you struggle with those relationships that you need a Torah? He said to the angels, no, it's not meant for you. Do you have jealousy or an evil inclination that you might murder or commit adultery, or what? You don't need the Torah. We need the Torah. Mankind needs the Torah because we are made up of this dual nature of the body and the soul. We have this struggle that that's ongoing. And so that, says Rabbi Volbe, is the same conversation, the same type of conversation that's going on in this midrash. When the angels say man is full of lies, so it's true. It's true because we're full of inconsistencies. We're not perfect. And when God says, I'm going to hurl truth to the earth, what's that? What's truth? The truth here is Torat Emet, Toras Emes, the Torah of truth. God says there's a solution. It's true, man is full of lies. Man is full of inconsistencies. Let's give them the truth. Let's give them the Torah. And through Torah, they can bring the truth that's in the foundation of their soul to bear, to the forefront. That's the purpose. So it's exactly the same conversation. It's because they are full of lies, because they're lacking. That's why this is meant for them. It's because they're the ones who need to discover truth, and they can do that through the Torah. That's how Rabbi Volbe understood this midrash, that the truth that was hurled to the ground refers to the Torah, and that's how truth springs up from the earth, as it concludes. Truth springs up from the earth because now from the earth, from us, from man, can come forth truth, because we can now develop ourselves. And again, this is through performing the mitzvot, which we really talked about this the very first class, how there's as a mission, we try to emulate the ways of God and draw close to God. And so certain mitzvot are, by definition, emulating God, and certain mitzvot draw us closer, just in their nature, draw us nearer to God. But it's through the mitzvot that we can develop ourselves, and also through Torah study, because when we study Torah, we engage our minds in God's will, and that's ultimate truth. Ultimately, the source of all truth is from God. And so when we're studying God's will, so we're discovering truth. But what does it take to really discover the truth in something, the Emes? So take a look at number 4. And here's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. And it says, Rabbi Yishmael, his son, the son of the person listing in the previous Mishnah, said, he who learns in order to teach, it is granted to him to study and to teach. But he who learns in order to practice, it is granted to him to learn and to teach and to practice. So this Mishnah, the sages are teaching us that there's 2 ways to learn. Some people learn just to have knowledge and to be able to teach. And some people learn to be able to practice. And if we learn just to teach, so we'll be able to teach, but we won't know how to practice. But if we learn in order to teach and to practice, then we'll know how to practice as well. But Rabbeinu Yonah, again with the same medieval commentary, but this is not from his Gates of Repentance, but from his commentary on the Mishnah. If you turn to the second page, number 5, so he explains that it's not exactly, the way he understands the Mishnah is not exactly that way. One who studies Torah in order to teach, says Rabbeinu Yonah, the explanation is not, God forbid, that this is speaking about studying in order to teach and not to do. Right? The first clause of the Mishnah said, one who studies Torah in order to teach will learn and teach. And one who studies Torah in order to practice will teach and practice. He says it's not talking about someone who's only doing it to teach and doesn't plan to practice, since such a person is giving it his hand neither to learn nor to teach. He says you have to learn the Torah to practice the Torah. Rather, it is in order to do according to that which is forbidden and that which is permissible, and not to toil and look into much, as maybe he will find something forbidden in the permissible things. Instead, he takes things according to their simple meaning. Because of that, he will only be given the opportunity according to his thought, which is to study and to teach, but won't necessarily be practicing correctly. So what he means is that when it says that one studies Torah in order to teach, he studies Torah in order to teach and to practice. But what do we mean by practice? He's like, he looks on the surface, and whatever it looks like it's saying, that's what he's going to do. But he's not delving into it. He's not spending time. He's not exploring and thinking deeply about it. So that person is ultimately not going to be practicing correctly. Their actions are not going to, because the person didn't delve into it, didn't explore, didn't consider deeply. So the actions that emerge from that study are not going to be perfect. They're going to be lacking still, because he didn't give it proper weight. That's what the first person described in the Mishnah. The second person, one who studies Torah in order to practice, will be given the opportunity to study, to teach, and to practice, meaning to say that his intention is to analyze. I'm reading the second paragraph here, number 5. His intention is to analyze his learning so as to know the truth of the matter, and is willing to toil several days and even years to fathom a small thing and to conduct himself according to the truth. Behold, this is one who's studying in order to practice, as the whole thrust of his intent is only that his action be truthful. So he's using these important words, truthful. He's looking for the truth. He wants to know what's the Emes. Therefore, he will be given the opportunity to study, to teach, and to practice. That is all included in action, meaning I think what he means is he'll be practicing correctly. So what he's saying is, if we appreciate that the Torah is God's message to us of what his will is. So every detail is important to properly explore and properly understand and put into action. And if we leave if we just get the surface, then we haven't reached Emes. We haven't reached truth yet. But if a person does it, and that's the first person, but the second person is studying to teach and to practice, meaning they want to get it exactly right. This is God's will we're talking about. This is Emes. This is truth. This is the true decisions. So are we just, are we just going to read it once and say, okay, it sounds like this, I'm going to do this? Or are we going to delve into it and take the time, as he says, several days or even years to fathom just a small thing? Each detail is so important. This is God's will. This is Emes. This is truth. And if you want to arrive at the truth, you have to give it the proper attention. If we just look at the surface of something, we're usually not going to find the Emes of it, the truth of it, right? This is true of anything. We see it's like there's a facade, right? So you don't really, without exploring something properly, without delving into it, so you're not going to arrive at the truth. The truth is deep. The truth takes exploration, takes investigation, takes introspection. There has to be a process to arriving at the correct conclusions. We sort of mentioned this last week, that if one of the things that we concluded with is, at least when faced with a question, if the answer comes easily, then you know that you're being affected by your biases. But if it's something that you struggle with, so then you can at least hope that you're giving it proper weight on both sides. Because if you're trying to arrive at something at truth, so it's not going to be necessarily right there on the surface. It's going to take further investigation. So that's the calling here. That's the calling, is to, we have these inconsistencies. The Torah is a guide for how to work on ourselves and to find truth, to develop our character, and to arrive at proper conducting actions in life. Now, turning a little bit, but sort of taking it a step further, let's look at how the sages examined a problem. Okay? So I want to actually jump to source number 8. And it's an important Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. We're going to go back to the other ones, but I just prefer this order. And it says in the Mishnah, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. So first of all, that sounds pretty backwards, right? Do we want the dispute to endure or not, right? We want disputes to end. We don't want them to endure. We don't want them to continue. But it says if it's for the sake of heaven, it will endure. If it's not for the sake of heaven, it will not endure. What is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. So Hillel and Shammai, the famous sages of the Mishnah, you go through the Mishnah, they're always arguing, or if it's not them, it's their academies, it's their students arguing, all over the Mishnah. They were always arguing. But that, says the Mishnah, that is a controversy that's for the sake of heaven, and that is described as something that will endure. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and his congregation. Korach and his men who rebelled against Moshe, their controversy was not for the sake of heaven. You'll notice, by the way, that that's one side of the argument. It doesn't say Moshe, because Moshe's was for the sake of heaven. It was Korach and his congregation against Moshe, but theirs was not for the sake of heaven. They were totally biased. They were looking for their own power, and but the dispute of Hillel and Shammai, it says that was for the sake of heaven, and that's described as a dispute, as a controversy that will endure. Now that, like I said, that sounds backwards. We don't want controversies to endure. So how do we understand this? So let's jump back up to number 6. And here we have a quote from the Talmud in Yevamos, which deals with levirate marriage. And it's going to list off a whole bunch of disputes between Hillel and Shammai. We're not going to go into the details of each one. They're not important for right now, but we'll just list them up. It says, coming here, although Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree with regard to the following cases. Rival wives. Okay, again, we're not going to get to what that means. It's a very complicated case that they're referring to, but it has to do with marriage, okay? And sisters, and they disagree on an outdated bill of divorce, and with regard to an uncertain married woman, and to one who divorced his wife and later she lodged together with him in all these different scenarios that they had disputes about in Jewish law, to the issue of betrothal by money, and with the equivalent value of money, and by a pruta, or with the equivalent value of a pruta. So they debated many topics. There's just a few of them, but these are all specific areas that have to do with marriage. And in all these areas, one opinion would disqualify the other one from, let's say, being permitted to marry another man, let's say. So you might think, therefore, that if I'm from the students of Hillel, I would want to be careful if I was marrying a woman from the communities of the students of Shammai, because maybe she's one of these scenarios where I disagree in whether she's permitted to be married, because maybe she was fit into one of these scenarios, right? So maybe they would stay away from each other. But it says, even though they had disputes over all these things, and it explains, despite the fact that these halachot, these laws entail important ramifications depending on whether or not these women were married or fit for marriage, or whether their offspring are fit for marriage, yet nevertheless, Beit Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Hillel, nor did Beit Hillel refrain from marrying women from Beit Shammai. They still would marry women from the other community. Now, the Talmud goes on to explain that if they knew that it was one of these scenarios, then they wouldn't. But if they didn't know that it was, then they trusted that they wouldn't assume that it was, and they trusted the other side to tell them if it was, and a situation where they would disagree on the permissibility of it, and they would marry girls in those situations. And it says this serves to teach you that they practiced affection and camaraderie between them to fulfill that which is stated, love, truth, and peace. In the Hebrew, that it teaches you shechiba v'reut nohagim zeh bazeh. They had this dearness and friendship between them to fulfill the pasuk, the verse ha'emet v'ashalom ahevo, that they loved truth and peace. So that was a story. They would still marry girls from the other community, even though possibly it could be that she was not permitted. They assumed the other people would tell them if that was the case. If we held that she wasn't permitted, you would tell us, even though you hold that she is permitted, we trust you. And that's because they practiced affection and camaraderie, fulfill that which is stated, love, truth, and peace. Says the Maharsha, one of the great commentaries on the Talmud, number 7. Even though it is impossible for both opinions to represent absolute truth, emet la'amito, right? This is a question of, is this woman still married or is she no longer married, right? It's one or the other, right? Is she permitted for another man to marry her because she's no longer married? It's one or the other. So even though it was one or the other, still, because of the peace and love that existed between them, they are all true. As we learn in Tractate Chagiga, they are all the words of the living God given to one shepherd. So the Maharsha quotes an idea, an important idea in Torah, which is that there's many possible interpretations of Torah. And what we say is Elu ve'elu, these and these, divrei Elokim Chayim, are the words of the living God. Because there's God, God is not limited in the same way that we are. God gave a Torah that allows for many interpretations. Now, it's not a free game. There's, it's within certain rules and within our tradition, but there's many truths within Torah. So Maharsha says that both could be true at the same time. Now, there's something that he calls emet la'amito, the ultimate truth, the absolute truth, and that's going to be whatever the conclusion in Jewish law is. That's going to be the absolute truth. But he still says that you can have, but both could be true on a certain level because of this concept that there's different interpretations of Torah, and Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chayim, these and these are both the words of the living God. They could both be true at the same time. The interesting thing is that in the middle there, he sticks in, I mean, that should be enough, right? If you want to say why they're both true, so just say they're both true, because you can have more than one interpretation of Torah. But in the middle, he throws this in, and it's really because the Talmud says it. He says, because of the peace and love that existed between them, they are all true. What does that have to do with anything? Why does the fact that they had peace and love between them make it that both sides are true? They're true because there could be different interpretations of Torah, and they could both be true. What is the peace and love that they had between them why does that make any difference? So Rabbi Volbe explains beautifully that the idea is that when there is peace and love between two sides in an argument, and there's no personal bias, so then, and the dispute is l'shem shamayim, is for the sake of heaven, then we can accept it as divrei Elokim Chaim, as a true interpretation of Torah. An interpretation of Torah has to be, right, we're seeking the truth. It has to come from an unbiased place. If I already know the conclusion that I want to reach in my reading of the Parsha, because I read in the New York Times today that this is the latest and greatest in what we should all believe, right? And now I want to look for it and include it in my sermon. Well, that's not truth. That's bias, right? The truth is to want to discover within Torah itself truth. What's the emes of Torah? And that has to be done using the tradition of Torah, not drawing from outside. And it also can't be done with personal bias, right? Because I want it to say a certain thing, right? I want it to say that everybody should pay their rabbis $1 million, right? Look, that's what it says, right? No, that's probably a little biased, right? So it has to come. There can't be personal bias, and it can't be influenced by outside pressures. Then it's l'shem shamayim. Then it's for the sake of heaven, and then it's truth. And because there was love and peace between Hillel and Shammai, they weren't coming from, they just arguing for argument's sake or personal bias. So both of their conclusions could be true conclusions in Torah. That's how they were both true. That's how they could both be Divrei Elokim Chaim, the words of the living God. And that's why the Mishnah says that because their dispute was l'shem shamayim, was for the sake of heaven, it will endure. Meaning their interpretations of Torah, their interpretations of life, their outlooks, their perspectives can endure as truth, even though they're in conflict with each other. But they could both have a level of trueness to them because they are unbiased and for the sake of heaven, and therefore they will endure because they are true Emes, interpretations of Torah, and therefore they endure. But if the explanation, if the argument being made is not coming from and the argument for what our perspective on life should be is coming from a biased place, then it's not a true interpretation, and therefore it doesn't endure. It's not real. It's not a true enduring interpretation of Torah. And so that's this beautiful idea that when we explore Torah and we want to find, and we're exploring it to discover what's the true path, where is truth, where does truth lie? So we need to be like Hillel and Shammai. We have to be we have to be peaceful and free of personal bias and exploring l'shem shamayim. And just to conclude with the analogy of the Ramchal, of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, for us, how do, we don't always have the answers, right? So where do we turn to find answers and to find direction? And the answer is we have to look to our sages. We have to look to our sages. And he describes it beautifully. If you look at number 9, he says, to what is this analogous? He's talking about a person's, attempt to find the right path. He says it's analogous to a labyrinth. This is a garden planted for amusement. He's writing this in the mid-18th century, I think, early 18th century, early 1700s. This is a garden planted for amusement commonly known to the noblemen. The hedges of plants are arranged into many intricate walls. Among them, many confusing and interlacing pathways, all of which appear similar. Right? It's a hedge maze. The goal is to reach the lookout tower in the middle of the maze. But among these pathways, some of them truly lead one to the tower, while others deceive him, leading him to stray away from it. One who walks between the path is not at all capable of seeing or knowing if he is walking along a correct path or a deceptive one. For each one appears similar. There's no noticeable difference whatsoever to the eye beholding them. He will not reach the tower unless he knows the correct path through prior experience and visual familiarity by having entered it before and successfully reached the goal, namely the tower. One standing on the lookout tower, on the other hand, can see all of the pathways before him and discern between the true and false ones. He is in a position to warn those walking in them and tell them, this is the path to take. He that is willing to believe him will reach the designated place, but he who is not willing to believe him, but will rather follow his own eyes, will certainly remain lost and fail to reach it. So too here, one who still has not ruled over his evil inclination is lost in the midst of the pathways and cannot distinguish between them. But those who rule over their evil inclination, who have already reached the tower and left the pathways, and who clearly see all the pathways before their eyes, they can counsel those who are willing to listen, because these people that we must trust. And what he's teaching us is that we have to look to our sages for guidance. They have overcome their inclinations. They have worked on these biases. They've worked on their character, and they know the path. So we don't know the path because we're blinded by all these things, by our own character. But they know the path. So if we want to know the direction to get to the spot in the maze of life that we need to get to, if we want to know what's the correct path, so the answer is, what's the true path? We have to turn to our sages, because they have overcome all biases. They've overcome they've developed themselves and discovered through unbiased analysis what is the correct path, and they can show us the way. Okay.
Shukran, Rabbi. Thank you.